Saudi Aramco. Isolation, lockout, and use of hold tags, procedure. General requirement. During job planning, an isolation plan shall be developed that shall identify all locations to be isolated, types of isolating devices to be used and site, and job-specific procedures for isolating the equipment. The isolation plan shall include a blind list if blinds are to be used. The blind list shall, at a minimum, include the following blind information: blind number, blind rating, date of installation, location, installer name, date of removal and remover name. The isolation plan shall be reviewed and verified by relevant Saudi Aramco facility management. For example, the operations shift superintendent for the unit where the isolation will occur, and contractor site management prior to the isolation work being performed. In some cases, additional Saudi Aramco operations shift superintendents shall be required to also concur with the plan, for example, where the isolation affects adjacent process units or other facilities. The Saudi Aramco facility management shall specifically concur with the blind list where plot and battery limit piping is involved. All necessary isolation and blinding equipment and devices, locks, tags, properly rated blinds, etc., shall be made ready and inspected before commencing work. All forms of isolation, electrical, mechanical or otherwise, shall use the lock and hold tag, Saudi Aramco Form 525, at every isolation point. Equipment name. Date and time of lockout. Name, badge number, organization, contact phone and signature of the individual who installed the isolation device, the reason for the isolation. Contractors shall establish an isolation, lockout and use of hold tag program for grassroots projects that is compatible with GI 6.012 and this chapter. For existing facilities, contractors are required to implement the Saudi Aramco proponent organization's isolation procedure. Electrical lockout and tagout, lock, tag, clear try. Isolation shall be considered complete only when no associated control device is capable of energizing the equipment. In situations where it is not possible to lock out an isolating device, isolation may be accomplished by removal of fuses, disconnection of electrical cables, or physical removal of a component of the system supplying energy to the equipment. The point of physical interruption shall be identified with a fully completed hold tag. Each lock on a piece of equipment or on a multiple lockout clip shall be identified with a subsequent hold tag. Each organization issuing locks shall have a system of uniquely identified locks. Acceptable methods include color coding, stamping, or engraving locks appropriately. Each lock shall be keyed separately, with no duplicate key, to ensure removal only by the authorized user. Operations representatives shall be the first to install their locks and shall be the last to remove them. Maintenance personnel shall install their locks at each corresponding isolation point. Every individual worker shall have in place his personal locks at all lockout locations. Work shall not be allowed to commence nor shall any maintenance material and device be placed on the isolated equipment until a verification test has been performed to ensure isolation has been correctly carried out and that no residual energy exists within the equipment. Clear the area of all potential hazards associated with an accidental startup, for example, tools, materials, personnel at a hazardous location. Then a verification test, or try, shall be witnessed by all affected parties and shall be conducted for each potential energy source for the equipment being isolated. No padlock and lockout device shall be cut or forcefully removed without the permission of the lock owner's superintendent or operating shift superintendent, and such actions shall be in accordance with GI 6.012. A group lockout procedure shall be implemented during maintenance and construction activities involving large numbers of personnel, such as turnarounds and inspections, TIS, facility expansions or compressor repairs. Personnel shall be afforded individual protection and the following steps shall apply to group lockout. An operations representative shall lock and tag each isolation point with single-keyed locks per the requirements of this document or written departmental isolation procedure and instructions. The maintenance and construction supervisor shall also lock and tag each isolation point. The maintenance and construction supervisor's keys to these locks shall be placed in a group lockout box. Multiple lock clips, hasps, shall then be attached on the closed group lockout box, as required. The operations representative shall install his lock and tag on the group lockout box first. He shall maintain possession of his keys until the job is complete. Each member of the maintenance and construction crew shall then place his lock and tag on the group lockout box, use a multiple lock clip, hasp, if necessary, and maintain possession of his keys until the job is complete. When a craft shift change occurs and work has not been completed, the oncoming shift may either replace the previous shift's locks and tags with their own locks and tags, in which case the offgoing shift shall remove their locks and tags. Transfer keys between shifts. This transfer requires the craft supervisors to conduct a detailed review of installed locks and tags. Hold tags belonging to the original shift crew shall be signed by the oncoming shift personnel, or entirely new tags shall be completed by the oncoming shift and installed to replace the original shift's hold tags. Piping or equipment shall be isolated and blinded. Piping or equipment shall be isolated and blinded and the contents drained, vented or purged before any work is performed, inspections, repairs, maintenance, modifications, etc. Operations or proponent organizations shall ensure that specific isolation, lock and hold tag procedures are in place to protect personnel when such activities are performed. The levels of isolation are listed in the increasing order of protection, first being the lowest and last being the highest, and shall be applied accordingly depending on the nature of work. If isolating by double block and bleed, DBB, which involves locking closed two isolation valves in series, and locking open a drain and vent valve between the two isolation valves, a hose or hard piping shall be attached to the drain valve to ensure that any liquid that might pass is carried away from the work site and all locks shall be tagged. Notes: all means of isolation shall be locked and tagged accordingly. When using a single block valve, fluid shall be removed and valve tested for leakage before commencing work. In order for DBB to be utilized, the subsequent bleed, vent, and drain valve shall be adequately sized in order to handle the upstream pressure in the event the first isolation valve fails and passes. Vents and drains shall be verified to be clear of obstruction. Double block and bleed assembly with chain locks and tags. Single block valve and DBB isolations shall not be used when equipment or piping containing hazardous materials is to be opened for confined space entry or hot work activities. This type of work activity requires isolation by blinding. Blinding involves inserting a slip blind or blind flange at a flanged joint or a swinging, rolling, a spectacle blind if provided by design. The rating, size, and location of all blinds shall be verified prior to installation and shall be reflected on the blind list. Each blind shall be stamped with the corresponding pressure rating and installed with matching gaskets. Blind gaskets shall be inspected for damage prior to installing, and swinging blinds. Written procedures shall be developed and implemented for major equipment with multiple connections and several low points where hazardous materials might remain trapped. These written procedures shall include, but not be limited to, drawings, PIDs, isometric drawings, etc., indicating all isolation points, drains and vents. The blind list, to track installation, and later removal, of all blinds. The steps or sequence for depressurization, draining and purging of equipment and associated piping before blinds are inserted. Site preparation steps, for example, covering saws. Proper sequence for installing blinds. Safe venting and disposal of any drained material. Associated equipment and piping shall be isolated by closing block valves, depressurization, draining and purging, for flammable and toxic service piping. Valves shall be chain lock closed and tagged before opening the flange and shall remain so while any blinds are in place. Valve locks and tags can be removed when the subsequent blinds are removed and the flanged connection restored to its original condition. Piping sections with valves on each end, drains at low points and vents at high points shall be isolated, depressurized and drained prior to work. Piping that has no drains or vents shall not be opened. A release permit shall be issued before commencing any blinding activity. Blind swinging and insertion shall be covered by a hot or cold work permit as well, depending on the circumstances, using impact wrench with generator versus using hand tools. Blinding shall be performed by loosening the bolts and cracking the flanged connection at the 5 o'clock position, down and away from the person performing the work, to allow any potential gases or liquids to be released away from personnel. When equipment, for example, pump, meter or filter, is removed from service for long-term maintenance or construction activities, subsequent blinds shall be required for associated piping. Blinds shall be inserted only at the isolated side, i.e., downstream, of each isolation valve that has been locked closed and tagged. Blinds shall be accessible and scaffolding shall be provided where necessary. The first blind inserted shall be the last to be removed. All bolt holes of the blind and corresponding flange connection shall be used when installing blinds. All slip blinds shall have tails. Safety precautions shall be taken, for example, use of self-contained breathing apparatus, for removing blinds since hazardous materials might have accumulated between the blind and the corresponding isolated valve if the valve was passing.